I appreciate it. So this is meant to be an introduction to Identity Manager. I have no intention of teaching you how to do complicated things, but there are so many bits and pieces and places and things that it's really hard to get started because it's where do I begin? And so let's get into that. So a little bit about what it is, where the moving parts are, and what more do we need to know. Unfortunately, I tried fitting reporting into this, but I didn't have time. It's complicated and not something that you can add on. You need to understand the other things first, so apologies. Okay, and management, okay. I've got the thing blocking it. Okay, so basically it's about synchronizing data between systems. That's how it started, that's how it began in DirXML 1.0. And keeping accounts in sync between systems is just a special case of data. It's XML based and you're synchronizing data from point A to point B. It's a nice hub and spoke architecture. Passwords really are just a special case of user data. They're different, they're trickier, but they really are just user data. They may be stored and retrieved differently, but they're just a special case. And then once they had that running, they said, well, this is great for automated stuff, but now I need a human to stick their nose in and break things. So we need a way to interject manual interventions, and that was the workflow engine. And then they said, well, I don't really want to hard code all my permissions and who gets what and how to control access. I'd rather have it based on some other stuff. Let's get an abstraction layer in there. And then they layered on top of that role-based permissioning. So when you come down to it, it's basically just all about synchronizing data, and everything's really just a special case of data. So some of the moving parts. At the center of it, you've got the IDM engine, or the meta directory. So eDirectory is at the heart of it all. We love eDirectory. Johnny's here. Yay, eDirectory. I very much want to see his session comparing eSend to eToFlame. Typically, we call the meta directory instance the identity vault. And that's just an instance of eDirectory. We need somewhere to put data, and that's what it is. The actual IDM engine is a process that runs inside NDSD. So back in the 32-bit days, this was a problem because, the JVM needed a lot of memory, being Java-based, and you were limited to a 2 gig process size, and either needs some memory. And div cache comes out of that memory space. And now you're trading off div cache against heap size for Java, and your total is 2 gigs. That started to be a problem. If you're still running 32-bit eDirectory, it's probably worth getting to 64-bit just so you just don't have to care about that. You still have to care, but whatever. And so really there's 3 core modules that get loaded. There's of course more, but the 3 core ones are JVM load. And this one's important because if ever you break your JVM, what you do is you move this library out so that when eDirectory starts, it can't JVM load, so it can't load the JVM, and therefore you can go fix the things that are broken. And so it's useful to know about that. DirXEvent, which a special case of that is interestingly used in the bidirectional eDir driver. eDirectory doesn't naturally have a changelog facility, but DirXEvent actually is almost a changelog facility. And they took that and tweaked it a bit to make it the changelog for that. And interestingly, for anyone doing identity governance, the identity governance with the identity with changes and identity governance is actually using DirXEvent again. It's like, it works. It's very good at getting events out of eDirectory, and VRDIM. And so DirXEvent is the one that watches the directory for changes to objects and generates an event according to the filter. So that's what catches the events. And then VRDIM, which is virtual replicas. I actually don't know what DIM stands for in this context, but it was from the original name of the product was virtual replicas. And that's where the policy engine is. That's where the processing, handing it off to things. DirXEvent catches the event, VRDIM does something with it. If you're on Linux and you run NDS-trace-c modules, or if you're in NDS-trace and just type modules, when you see your list of running modules, one of them, these 3 would be there on a server with IDM. Just a side technical note, these are auto-loaded when the NCP pseudo server object is flagged as being part of associated to a driver set. You're not supposed to be able to modify that object. Support can help you. There's tools that expose it if it ever becomes an issue. But basically, the act of adding a server to a driver set sets that flag, and that actually causes these modules to auto-load. So it's not like some of the other NDS modules where you'd have to edit the I forget where it is. There's a file in NDS modules that lists the modules that auto-load. You don't ever have to do that. So that's the engine. The engine's at the heart of it. It's catching events, it's processing them, and it's doing something with them. Well, so where does that go? And so there you have drivers. These are either Java or native code that know how to talk to the application. And they all, of course, know how to talk to the IDM engine. You can write your own. There's a whole bunch written by Microfocus. As you'll see at the end, my company's got a bunch we've written for complicated products. And this is the thing that takes the event. So DX event has caught the event in the vault. It's passed it through processing to change it, manipulate it, spindle and fold it. And now it's got to go somewhere and do something. And so the engine sends it to the driver shim. And that's what actually then talks to the native application. So I say it's Java or native code just as an example, because Java, many of them are Java, some of them though are native, like the Active Directory driver runs a DLL that has to be running on a Windows box. And so this driver can run in the engine's context or process. So it uses up memory in the engine process, which is NDSD's process. As you can see, this 32-bit 2 gig memory limitation would start to become more of a problem, or in a remote loader. And a remote loader is really just the bare minimum parts of the engine that can run on another system, that can that can handle it so that you can run, it can do the minimum. It doesn't have to, it doesn't need VRDIM, right? It doesn't need that equivalent. It doesn't really need the policy engine, although it has a piece of it, but it just needs the ability to read the XML, know what to do with it, send it onto the application, and then handle it, and then load and provide all the functions necessary for a driver is expecting out of the engine. And so that's why I say it has a shell of the engine. And if you look at the jar files it delivers, or the library files, you'll actually see it has the 3 core engine jars for, on the remote loader, although it doesn't usually use them. It's just that it needs a bunch of support functions from them. And as noted, you can cross operating systems. The AD driver shim needs to run on a Windows server. What if the engine's on Linux? Well, then just run a remote loader on Windows. Lotus Notes, for example, Lotus Notes is a fun one because it's actually 100% Java with some Notes-specific things, but it doesn't actually have to be on a Notes server. But if you want to do passwords on Notes, you really want something that can access the file system. And so you have to think carefully where you place them. And I'm simplifying this. There are actually some custom remote loaders. The Omnibond stuff for AS400, mainframes, and things like that actually have their own, they wrote their own remote loaders. And so their entire driver includes their remote loader. They took the Microfocus code and ported it so that, because obviously they weren't going to port Java to run on some of these mainframes for their instances. That's too much of a load that they'd be for what they need. They just ported over the stuff they needed. Inside the engine. So I said that, VRDIM processes stuff going on. So what happens inside the engine? It has 2 main things. There are actually a few more, but the core are policy and style sheets. And we have 2 channels. We have data flowing from the identity vault to the application. That's the subscriber channel. And then we have the data coming from the application back to the identity vault, the publisher channel. There are 2 independent threads. To complicate things, there's a 3rd thread for priority synchronization, and there's a 4th thread for what's called CPRS, but we won't talk about those. And so these happen independent of each other, and it's really the AD driver where you see it the most. They will sometimes get interwoven, as in something is happening on both at the same time, and it's sending to trace, and it's really hard to read because both of them are interwoven. If you had seen my session at TTP EMEA 2021 virtual, I did a session showing a good way to get around that. They are recordings and things still available on the ttp.org site. Style sheets do this, and style sheets process that XML event using XSLT. Policy, uses DirXML Script, which is a custom language, XML-based, and it's very readable. And we'll show an example a little later. You'll see it is quite readable. It was actually, in the way they wrote it, it really is easy to understand as long as English is your major language. Sorry to those who don't speak English. I can't help you. I blame, American company. Policy is easier than a style sheet for me, and both work. And it just depends on your preference. However, DirXML Script is really designed to make IDM-specific tasks easier. So there's a lot of functionality that, while it's possible to do an XSLT, it's a bit of work, whereas it's just a simple token in policy. I wrote a book on policy. There's 100, actually, I've added a few more since I published that, but there's about 130, 140 different tokens that can do different things. And each one is, a fair bit of thought was put into them, and they're the things that are basically useful in an identity in a context. So if your special case of data is identities, then these make sense. So what you use is up to you. Some people love style sheets, and I've seen drivers that are 100% style sheet based. I disagree with that because it's throwing away some of the functionality built into the engine that would really help, but you know, it works and it's up to you. So one of the first things that, as we talk about all this, you need at least some idea of what I'm talking about. And amusingly, I didn't realize it, but I'm a little bit right-left dyslexic. I have real trouble remembering right and left. And so when iManager was here, I had so much trouble remembering publisher and subscriber channel. You know, but when you'll see in a moment in Designer, when it went to up and down, I have no trouble remembering it. It amuses me that I have this little mental quirk. So if you go into iManager that has the IDM plugins, you'll see there's an IDM administration tool. If you dig down through it, you'll get a view. On the left-hand side, you see the identity vault at the center, and it's got some drivers hanging off it. So this one, just 6 examples. I just pulled this from a system. I had to hide the name, sorry. And this is actually talking to an AIX system running one of those Omnibond AIX drivers, as it turns out, Linux Unix drivers for AIX. And you can see that, and this is called the fishbone only because, you know, kind of looks like the backbone of a fish with all the various bones sticking out from the central spine. And so on the bottom, we have the subscriber coming out of the identity vault, heading to the right to the application. And then on the left, we have, and then on the top, we have the publisher channel coming out of the application and heading to the identity vault. And in iManager, you can edit, you can click on any of these little chevrons, as they're called, and it'll show you the list of policy objects that are inside them. And then you can open a policy object, and then either, it could be a style sheet, it could be a policy, and then you can open an editor. As we saw in the ID console and session earlier this morning, one of the questions was asked is, in the new ID console, can you edit those policies in? And the answer is no. And that's because the design was meant for something else. And, you know, they were designing for something a little bit different. And that's okay. It feels like a loss of functionality, but again, they have different design goals and they've met them, so be it. Obviously, there's a ton of items on here I could show you, but the goal here is just to get you an idea. And so if you were to get yourself started in IDM, one of the things you'd want to be able to do is look at iManager, look at the drivers and whatnot. Now, I wouldn't say develop them in iManager. Used to do that before Designer came around, and Designer's way easier. Designer's is Eclipse-based, and it's meant to make life easier in many ways. I should have unhidden it. There's a palette on the right-hand side that you can't see because I always hide it. There's a teeny tiny arrow. How do I do that? Laser pointer. I should have expanded this icon here, and it shows you all the various drivers that Designer knows about that you could then just drag and drop. You still have to configure them. You have to do a lot of work, but at the bare minimum, it gets you started. But again, it's this hub and spoke architecture, which is a little more visible in Designer, where you have the identity vault at the center. That's a driver set, which is multiple yin-yangs. And then you have a bunch of different drivers here. And this is just a scratch pad I had handy. And here, in the window over here, if I were to click on a driver, you would see the fishbone, but I wanted to zoom in a bit. And here the fishbone is up and down, with the identity vault at the bottom and the subscriber channel heading up and the publisher channel heading down. And I find this much easier to remember, just because of silliness. There's a couple of each of these different locations, the event, matching, create, placement, command, has a purpose, and you should do the appropriate things in them. I don't want to dive into that because that's beyond, I'll never finish if I start down that path, so I'm going to pass. I have to decide which way to go. Okay, so I figured it was a little more important to talk about events, though, than necessarily going into that. So let's use an example that starts in the subscriber channel. The events come out of the engine based on something happening in eDirectory. We have a filter, which is represented by here, notify and sync. This is actually one thing represented in 4 places. And it is right here and here in iManager. Designer at least got a little more subtle to point out there is actually a thing that happens here in this notify step that iManager didn't. So that was nice. And so something happens to an object whose class and attribute is in the filter. DX-Event sees it and says, aha, this is an event, and it hands it off to VRDIM. And so these are things like add or modify, delete, modify password, rename. There's actually a whole bunch more, but these are the obvious ones, right? Again, it's data, but in an identity context. So it matters that you added a user, you created someone, you deleted them, you renamed them, you moved them, or you just modified them. And as I said, modified password is a special case. And so this is basically what one of these XML documents would look like. It's a silly example. I made it up. In fact, I used Designer to make it up, which is even funnier because there's a neat way in Designer to make fake events so you can see them and practice and simulate them. And so here we have, it's a modify class name equals user, source DN. It's a modify attribute adder whose adder name is CN. Well, that's going to my test user. The one whose adder name is surname is going to user, and whose adder name is given name is going to my test. So imagine I changed the person's first, last, and CN all in one operation. And so, as I said, you could, within just trying to sort of nail down into that XML so you learn how to read it. So the modify, this is the current operation, and that's going to come up in, next session, that's for XPath. This is a side note, if ever you're doing XPath, this is the current context. The operation is the current context. If you learn only one thing, the operation is the current context. Will help you with everything in XPath. So inside this node, we have an XML attribute called class name, and that's user is in the class. And then also within it, just shortened to make life easier and visible, we have a source DN. And it's a little weird. It's in the format of OU or OU in backslash format, right? So this is the tree structure. So imagine LDAP just flattened, take away all the CN equals, OU equals, and order reverse. So it's rootmost to leafmost, whereas LDAP is leafmost to rootmost. Internally, for whatever reason, this is the format IDM uses for DNs. It throws away the CN equals, which means from this directly, you can't get back to LDAP, but there is a way. It does actually pass the information. I'm just not going to show it right now. And so you can get backwards. And then that little segment of modify attribute adder, whose adder name is surname, add value with a value. This is an attribute changing. And so that's basically how you read these. And the add would look basically the same. It would actually be an add adder instead of a modify adder. That makes sense. A rename wouldn't have any attributes except old name. A move would have the parent DN and wouldn't really have any attributes. A delete would have nothing, basically, and so on and so forth. And so you get a feel. This is the sort of XML we're looking at. Okay. And as I said, everything's XML, and of course, except when it isn't. So the delimited text driver is a great counterexample where you have to use XSLT because the end result on the subscriber channel, as you're sending something to be written to a file, has to be text. It has to be, it could be XML, but rarely do you want that. Usually you want some kind of comma-separated values. And so as you do comma-separated values, that's not XML, so the engine can't process it. So you have to do style sheets. I'm pretty sure I can do it in policy. I think I know how, but it's just easier to use a style sheet for that. And the driver ships with one by default. The JWC driver is not exactly the same case, but in that case, it's the shim itself that converts it. So that's probably a bad example. But in the limited text driver, it's actually policy that converts it to it. If you're looking at using the delimited text driver and you're not locked into requiring using the Microfocus one, the delimited text driver from Stefan van Kalberg, Boz told me how to say it last time. I can't say the guy's last name. He's Belgium, I tell you, or Dutch, or whatever he is. Great, great driver. So much better than the Microfocus one, and you don't have to worry about any of that nonsense, but that's a side note. So I talked about DirXML Script versus XSLT, and I wanted to give you an example. So I made up this silly example based on what we did. And so we're in Designer. I've made a policy. I've opened it in the policy editor. I could have done this in iManager, but it just looks slightly different, but it's basically the same. I find the Designer one easier to use. And so we have, I gave it a name. There's no description because I was trying to save space. Oh, I guess I did just put a description, but I forgot to in the screenshot. And so the way it works, we've got conditions and actions. In the conditions, these are ANDed. You could click on that and OR them. You can make another condition group, so you can have, the two condition groups could be ANDed, but the contents are ORed. So you have a lot of flexibility here. And there's some other tricks you can do to get additional and/ors inside here if necessary. But at a simple level, so I'm just checking if class name equals user, Okay, well, we had that class name equals user in our document. All right, check. We're gonna fire on that. So we'll match that, great. If operation equals modify, well, that's how I started off talking about, so that's true. And then if operation attribute surname is changing, is the surname of the user changing? And if all these three things are true, then send an email. Now, this isn't fully populated. Again, it was truncated to make it fit nicely. But you can see here, as I was saying, it's really quite readable. So the object is a policy. The parent node for the entire object is policy. And then you have a bunch of rules inside it. Inside a rule, you start off with your conditions, and you can see we're in an AND block. You can guess what would happen if you clicked on the AND and changed it to OR. These two would change to open, close, ORs. And you can see we've got, if class name equals user, if operation equals, if op adder name equals, name surname, op equals changing. There's a lot of different operations. So there's equals, there's matches, and then under mode, there's case insensitive, case sensitive, numeric, less than, greater than. Far more interestingly, regex. Regex is great because anything you can do in regex, you can suddenly do on a string in here, and it's relatively quick. Finally, once you've got your conditions, you've got your actions. Now, I only did one just because it's to make the point. I picked an interesting one, which is an example where, while to do this in XSLT would be possible, it would be hard because you'd have to know the Java class to call and all the parameters to pass, and you'd have nothing presented to you. In other words, everything's on you. There's nothing handed to you in the GUI. You're throwing away the advantage of all the work they did on making life easier just to use XSLT. But you could do it. I just don't know why you would. And so token is do, send, email. So first off, conditions all start with if, actions all start with do. And then things that manipulate values are tokens. And so you can see that it's very easy to read as you get used to it. And so, well, we need a password as an argument, because obviously if we're sending email, well, I'm not going to put a password here. That's crazy. Who hard codes passwords anymore? I will use a named password, which is an encrypted attribute on the driver object that the engine knows how to retrieve. And so it can go pull the name password, email password, pass the value in here, and that's great. I don't have to show anything. You can see the server. I use $SMTP server, which I typoed. It should be $SMTP server because it needs it's a variable. You could replace variables with $sign at the beginning and $sign at the end, and then this way I don't have to put it in. I can have a variable elsewhere, so when they tell me, "Oops, we've changed mail servers," I just change it in one place, and all my rules automatically continue to work. And then I have a string whose name is subject. So I can pass in a subject, I can pass in a to, I can pass a from, a message. I just, again, simplified it for the point. But I didn't grab it at the bottom of the screen, but at the bottom there'd be a little tab that says policy view, and there's an XML view. And you can flip back and forth really fast, and you can make a change in here on the policy side, and then go look on the XML, and it's reflected because, of course, it's the same thing, you're just two different views. So what's nice is if I decide to go in, and if I were to go in and edit and put the $sign at the end of SMTP server in the XML view and flip back, I would see right away that $sign would appear. And sometimes fixing something is really easy in the XML side, but would take dozens of clicks in the GUI. And sometimes doing something in the XML is really tedious because there's a lot of parameters, a lot of little things. You have to get everything just right. But on the other hand, doing it in the GUI is actually really straightforward. And what DirXML Script is great about it, what's great about DirXML Script is that you could do this backwards and forwards flipping. The GUIs are pretty good, and there's a lot of builders available, and pretty much anything you can think of is there. It's pretty rare that you have to do something else that's not there. It's possible, but rare. So that's about all I want to talk about on the engine side. Again, I literally could go on for hours and have on this topic, so I have to stop somewhere. So the next thing I want to talk about is the identity apps and user app. Now this actually is really providing a user interface. So the original IDM was designed to be an automated thing, right? HR hires you, HR fires you, and off you go. And so that's great. And that worked really well. first what they call 0-day start. Everybody shows up, all their accounts are made. Excellent. Well, but now they need some more stuff. So for example, although they are hired by HR to do this, it turns out that their boss would really like them to have access to that. So how am I going to go grant that to them? Oh, I'm back to manually doing stuff. That kind of defeats the purpose of IDM managing these sorts of things. So how can we give some way to sort of ad hoc request access to things that were not predefined and automatically done by HRs, or triggered by the stuff happening in HR? Well, we need a user interface. Years ago, I've lost track. I don't even know what year it was now. The Valve, that's how long ago it was, they bought Silverstream. And out of it, they got their web app. And they mostly turned that into the user application. Abhishek's listening. I lament the loss of Composer, Abhishek. Bring back Composer. Literally a party of one. The thing Silverstream had was an XML data mapping product, and it was designed for mapping XML. It was data mapping from this to that, XML being the intermediary format. And there's a teeny tiny piece of Composer left, buried deep, and it's really neat. And I've actually worked with Composer to do a driver. We were screen scraping at 3270. That was fun, and it worked really well. As far as I know, it's still working 12 years later. We haven't touched it because the licensing is such. I don't know if there's, Abhishek to tell me if they're still licensing it, the particular customer, because there was very few licenses left. Anyway.
It's 13 years, Jeffrey, and this is also your 18-minute warning.
Warning? Thank you. Okay. So in IDM 402A is where it all began. And it wasn't 402 patch A, it was 402A, which was a stupidly confusing nomenclature. But basically, it became real in 4.5 and higher. There was a new UI, and now finally in 4.8, the old user app is basically gone. There's almost nothing left of that original Silverstream user app. Again, Composer's probably the last bit of that. There's a teeny tiny bit of Composer left. I know Microfocus has a license to Composer because they compile the user app driver in it every year, every time they need a new one, which is fun because if you actually look at it, you can actually see how Composer worked under the covers. It's really interesting as you get more into this. You have to have seen Composer to understand it, and you can't get it anymore, and it's a shame. Again, I continue my campaign to resurrect it, Abhishek, which I know will never happen, and I know why, but I still wish. Anyway, so the new interface is called the Identity App. Singular, plural, I'm not sure. It's a newer design. If anyone watched the ID console first session this morning, it looks a lot like that because that's the new design language that Microfocus is using. They're trying to move everything over to it consistently. You can love it, you can hate it. I think some of the icons drive me crazy. I have learned to live with them, and I will just bury that deep in a bundle of rage deep inside that one day I will let out. But anyway, other than that, it's actually quite good. Parts of the user app still remain because under the covers, they're still using the same functionality. They've just changed the top-end GUI. And new parts are replacing others. In every release, they're doing more. They're migrating more bits and pieces over and around. Trying to explain what's going on in that move, how they're doing it under the covers. It's actually important to understand it and for troubleshooting, but I can't get into that here. I'm sorry. So ID Apps is basically what you're going to be using because it's available in 4.7 and 4.8 you have no choice. Well, 4.8.2 and higher you have no choice. So you might as well. So the upside, you now have a user interface. It's actually quite flexible, and there's some amazing functionality in it. The downside, it's a web app. Well, that means it needs a web server, it needs a database. It needs to connect to eDirectory because it's obviously not part of the engine anymore. It's not running in the engine context, which is good. But it uses OSP for single sign-on via OAuth, and we've got many layers added to troubleshoot. Almost all of them certificate related. Almost always. Host name and certificate related. It's fun. So this is the interface of the new ID apps. This is the dashboard. I should have gone to a screen that I didn't realize the ID console was so obvious. If I'd gone to the application, it looks exactly like the ID apps, but you can see the same color palette and design language. This is the default page everyone sees. I logged in as UA admin because I was using a target system. And you can see I have 19 roles and 2 resources. Here are some of my roles because, of course, I'm user app admin, so I'm the compliance administrator, provisioning administrator, and so on and so forth. This is a test system, so there's lots of requests for others pending and lots denied. All these things are widgets. all of them with the Manage as UA admin. I can manage and change the widgets that show up. And so a typical user might see this or might see that. I can do some permissioning based upon eDirectory groups, users, roles. So I have a lot of flexibility here. There's a little icon here for org chart, which got better in 4.8.3, which is nice. Along the top, we've got a bunch of different things. As an administrator, I will see administration configuration and entities. Other people, most people will not. And so, like I say, overall, it's a good redesign. And unfortunately, like any rewrite, there are subtle things that got missed. There's a particular one I won't start the argument about again. I've heard the rationale. I totally disagree with it. I accept it because not mine. I just think it's silly. And so be it. I believe part of my argument there actually got fixed in 4.8.3 because finally it seemed to have gotten through. I don't want to get into it. It's an old battle. Okay. So that's a nice, pretty GUI. So what does it do? Well, there are really two core things that matter here. It does a lot. Like you can do password changes or it'll kick you off to SSPR. You can do org chart. That's useful. But really, where it really shines is the notion of workflows and roles and resources. And one of the things they're trying to do in this version is actually merge them a little closer together. So a workflow are those manual intervention steps I was talking about, and roles and resources are a mechanism to grant you permissions in remote systems. So that's that abstraction layer I was saying. So let's come up with an abstraction. Maybe we'll link it to something in HR. So for example, my job is linked to a role. And so when HR puts me in a job code or whatever, I'll automatically pick up all these roles, which grant me resources, which grant me permissions. And so wanted to work through a simple workflow. This is really confusing. I could really spend hours again on the workflow, and I mocked this one up for this session in about 2 minutes. There is a palette here, as I was saying. I should have expanded on the driver side. And I literally just dragged these in, and there's a couple of different kinds of things. So, for example, I had this mapping action, and that is copying data from the form into the workflow, because there's two components to a workflow. There's a form the user sees, they interact with, they do stuff. When they're done, the workflow starts. I'll show you the form in a minute. And then I have a condition. Is it safe to add the role? Because whatever happens in this form, cool. It's not. If it's false, I'll go to the email error message. And if it's true, I'll assign a role, and then I'll just log the outcome regardless, and then I'm done. One of the things that's super duper confusing on this is, so first off, as a designer 4.8.3 for performance, although you see provisioning stuff up here, and if you're used to Designer before, it used to be up here in the top of this, in the outline view. Everything is now, although this will work in here, you can't get to it until you open the view. You have to get to this fourth tab here, which is called provisioning. Again, if you're using the latest Designer, you're going to look for this. You're not going to find it. You have to go here, provisioning, and it's this fourth tab here. I left this selected because things have properties. And so here's my, I just said ECMA test because I couldn't think of a test off the top of my head to put in, but I gave it a title, safe to add role. What's the test? So it has to return ECMA, and it returns true or false. True goes one way, false goes the other way. One of the design things I really dislike about this is if you right click on email error message, you'll get an extra editor available. It'll say show email. I forget what it says, show email something or other. If you click on start, right click, show data item mappings, you'll see something like this. And here we have a pre-activity, post-activity. And this is where we're saying before the form starts, set some pre-activity before the form starts, send some data into it, and then post-activity, take the data that they wrote in the form and copy it into what's called flow data, which is what I'm going to use inside the workflow. Similarly, this map token here does something similar. It's also got a data item mapping. Email has a custom one. And if you can't find what you're looking for, like if you can't figure out how do I set it, try the properties tab over here. Then right click on it and see if there's a show something menu. 9 times out of 10, it's right there in the right click. So, like I said, first we got to do the forms actually. There are two form engines, the classic and the new one that's forms.io. The classic is kind of still that Silverstream-based one. And for simplicity, I'm going to stick with the classic one now because the forms.io is still changing and growing, and they're completely different. So just to keep it simple, I'm going to start with that one. It still continues to work. They're working on making the forms.io better, getting feature parity and whatnot. So as I said, when the forms start, when you click Start Workflow, the first thing that happens is the pre-activity of the start happens. So you can fill in some data, like you can pre-fill some fields. Then the form renders, then it does what it's going to do. And then when it's complete, the post activity is used to copy the data into the workflow. But the pre-activity is really useful. Fields can have HTML events like on load, on change, on blur, so that when they're in their web thing and they click on it, on click, so if they do something, it'll react to those events and execute some ECMA. And so you can use jQuery to redesign the screen if necessary. So as an example, I was just using, should I grant this user a role or not, or something was what I was sort of working through my example. So I might have an on change on the field that selects a target user. So I've got a field, you have to pick the user. Who's my target, right? You could start it with you, the person who started it, but often you want it about someone else. You could do it both ways, it's up to you. So if you didn't have a selector, the default would be you're the recipient because you started it. On the other hand, you could start it for someone else. And it would react to that, and it would load the users list of group memberships just so it would display it. So again, that workflow, we were on the workflow tab down here. Now we're on the forms tab. And I just went and I added these fields. I added some extra, there's some off to the side, there's a line spacing, just that lets you make it pretty. And the little button here will try to render the form. So this is what that form looks like. So I got my show user info, user CN, should have rendered a picker, but I think this is just because I just did it. This is just like a preview. It's not meant to be complete, but at least I can see how my fields line up. I didn't finish completing it, but for the control, like this is a DN lookup, and this one's a DN display, and this one's a DN, so this one's text. And then when it's text, it's a string, and there's multiple types. Like there's so much in here you can do. But what I wanted to say was, I had to screenshot things down to make it all fit, or else it's unreadable. So that properties tag I was talking about, on the bottom left, there's a provisioning, was that fourth one. So imagine this is on this window here is on the bottom left. Under events, I added an onload. So when you pick the user, so I'm on the CN field, and you pick your user, on the onload, I wrote an onload event, and you can actually read it here. There's an ECMA editor if you click, but you can actually read the whole thing. I said ID vault get, which is how you reach out, which is an ECMA function they've added that lets you read eDirectory through LDAP. You don't have to authenticate it, it's just a built-in function. And the editor makes it nice and straightforward to use it. So I want to fill the field groups and I want to read the recipient. So my DN is the recipient. My class, and there's a whole directory abstraction layer I'm not going to talk about, but user is obvious. And I want the attribute group membership. So when we load and set this, I'm actually going to go set this field. And so you can do all sorts of games like that in it, and you can have events firing all over the place, and you get into a lot of trouble if you're not careful. So if you want to test the form, that's that little button here I was saying. And you can see it's pretty limited. And as I said, it passes the data into the start activity. And then so you have to copy things into what's called flow data, which is an XML structure you never see, you never read, but it's there and it's used to persist data. So it's just useful to know what it is. And I didn't even realize it was XML for the longest time. I didn't realize it actually was some XML document hanging around through the process. But once someone pointed that out, it was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. And actually, once you know that, you can start doing more tricks. But you don't actually have to know that fact, which is interesting. It's all GUI. And here's the problem. This is why this is a beginner's. There's so much more. The whole way workflow and XML.
6 minutes left.
Okay, this is a lot. I'm glad to help anyone with it. There's lots to do. I want to jump into roles and resources. You may be familiar with entitlements, you may not. The entitlement's a neat construct that's there. You have a single entitlement like group, and if you pass it a value, the driver will do something about groups with that value as a parameter. And so, although you didn't need 1,000 group objects in eDirectory to represent 1,000 groups in AD, you could use a group with a value, a group entitlement, give it a value that points at a particular group, the GUID in AD as it turns out, and it would go do it. So there's a DirXML entitlement object, which defines the entitlement, and there's a DirXML entitlement ref attribute, which gets added to objects. It doesn't just have to be users. Problem is, the entitlement value is usually a unique identifier, like a GUID. Can you look at a GUID and tell me what it means? I can't. And they're different in every system, so they're necessary, but they're not helpful. So we came with this construct of a resource, and a resource is a static, well, it doesn't have to be static, but it's generally a static definition of a single value, of a value of an entitlement. And so this resource represents group 1, 2, 3 in AD, and it contains the GUID to link the two together. So one entitlement object could be referenced by 10,000 resources, and each one would deliver just a single unique DirXML entitlement to an object. So these roles, these resources then get associated to roles. Now, it seems like there's a bit of an abstraction layer. Why don't you just assign it directly to roles? And the answer is you used to be able to. There's some value in having some other abstraction, but it's really, it is what it is. Just look at it. There's a 3-level hierarchy, 30 at the top, 20, 10, sort of an upside down pyramid. And so at the top, you have level 30, which you call business roles. You might link that to, say, the job, the position, the class that you're taking. And then that would then have child roles at level 20. And then other child, and that would have, those could have child roles at level 10. And so at level 10, you're granting, I need access to a particular group. Nice and simple, straightforward. You use those, you build those together in your toolkit to make some level 20s. So for example, a teaching assistant in a particular location needs certain accesses, the door cards, you're going to do things like that, just basic stuff. So then, and then at level 30, all teaching assistants, of which there would be many, and many roles, one role for each, would all include that level 20 that granted all those weird little permissions they just need so they can actually do their job. Roles could be granted. How do you manage them? You grant them, or you revoke them. You can do it by a SOAP call, which is actually how the engine does it, and it has some do add role actions. Again, you might be able to do an XSLT through a direct Java call, but you have to know all the parameters, whereas the GUI gives you all the things you need in DirXML Script. If you do it in a workflow, one of the actions in the workflow, my example was actually grant a role. But it ironically actually does it by SOAP too. You can manually request them in the new identity apps, which is actually done by REST if you're in the new API, in the new UI. Or imagine an external system. So if you had ServiceNow, you could tell it, go make a REST call or a SOAP call to the identity app to start handling it. And just a quick look inside the GUI. And so you would go to access request. You would go to access request. You get a screen that says make requests. Do you have any featured items? You as the admin can highlight some, go to your new requests and do it. Pick one. I just typed in RBPM and there we go. So there's some roles. What next? If you have a Linux VM, install either, then IDM, and you can have most of it installed in one box. Find something you connect to and have some fun with it. This note about ID apps you should read, it's basically almost always certificates. It's always certificates. And definitely ask for help. The forums at community.microfocus.com are actually pretty good. And right now, because they're on their second migration within a year or so, people have dropped off. Do ask. They call me a points piggy. I assume that's meant complimentarily. And I get points for answering questions. So I like answering questions. I like points. So feel free. And there's a bunch of people who are really, really good. The internal search kind of sucks. Google with site:/microfocus.com is much better. Some additional resources. I've written 2 books. The Definitive Guide to IDM Tokens and a Missing Manual for IDM Validator. You can buy them at that link. Go to the forums. They merged forums and cool solutions. I've got about 450 articles published. You can't find them from my old links because they haven't fixed that in them after the migration. And as a side note, I run an IDM user group. There's actually a Microfocus one. I'm waiting for them to do something, but I've been running my own, and we've had about 35 sessions. They're all recorded and all available. Email me personally, and I will talk to you about signing up. And I got to get this in. I do work for a company. We do consulting. We've got a couple of drivers. We have a different driver. We do Workday different than Microfocus does. It would be a really fun session, Abhishek, if just I could argue with your engineers about why they did what they did, and they can argue why I did what I did. We could have fun. That would be entertaining. I'm in. There's your challenge. We have one for Cisco Call Manager, Amazon Web Services, to provisioning users into AWS so they can manage AWS instances. We've got one for an EMR system. Legally, we're not even allowed to say their name out loud. It's insane. And a custom HTTP for SOAP and REST. So my contact info, and that's about it. I would take questions, but ironically, it looks like nobody asked a question. Oh. And I'm out of time anyway.
You're also out of time.
And to Johnny, no, not Kronos. Workday HR, the HR system in the cloud. Thank you very much.